Nah, pause everything you had planned tonight, because what just detonated between Rick Ross and DC Young Fly is not a beef. It is not a squabble. It is not a podcast disagreement. It is a full-scale culture earthquake. And by the time I am finished walking you through this thing, you are going to understand exactly why every rapper south of the Mason-Dixon line just went dead silent tonight. Rick Ross did not just take a shot at DC Young Fly. Rick Ross did not just clown DC Young Fly on Instagram. Rick Ross walked into a recording booth, opened his mouth, and etched DC Young Fly's name into the historical record of hip-hop forever, and the entire internet is about to combust right on top of it. Listen closely, because this is the part nobody is saying out loud. When you throw a jab on Instagram, you can delete it. When you clown somebody on a live stream, it disappears in 24 hours. When you shade someone in a group chat, that stays in the group chat. But the second Rick Ross took DC Young Fly's name and put it on a track, that was it. That was the point of no return. That was the moment the culture shifted, and that was the second this story stopped being funny and started being permanent. That is not social media. That is not a subtweet. That is not a passing joke on a podcast couch. That is a receipt pressed into a vinyl record that will outlive both of these men. And DC Young Fly, if you know anything about DC Young Fly, is not the human being you want walking around with a fresh grudge and a fully loaded microphone in his hand. I am going to walk you through this thing from the very first crack of the whip, because this saga between Rick Ross and DC Young Fly has been quietly boiling for almost half a decade. And Rick Ross just poured jet fuel on a fire that was already burning underneath the surface. Buckle in, because the twists in this story are going to have you rewinding this video 3 times, and by the ending, you're going to have a hot take you cannot wait to drop in the comments. Let us rewind the entire clock all the way back to 2021. Picture the scene. Rick Ross rolls up to the 85 South show. The entire couch is packed. DC Young Fly is locked in. Carlos Miller is ready. Chico Bean is ready. And the room is electric. Rick Ross sits down. The cameras start rolling. The energy is sky high. And everybody watching from home thinks they are about to get a legendary hip-hop conversation for the archives. And then, halfway through the interview, Rick Ross does something nobody in that studio saw coming. Rick Ross says he needs to step away and use the bathroom. Now here is the twist. Rick Ross never came back. Not 5 minutes later. Not 10 minutes later. Not an hour later. Rick Ross was gone. Vanished. Ghost. Evaporated. And I want you to sit with how strange that is for a second, because we are not talking about some random guest slipping out the back door of a small podcast in a garage. We are talking about Rick Ross, the Maybach music mogul, the biggest boss, walking out of a black-owned podcast that had shown him full love and respect, without so much as a goodbye handshake, a wave, or a nod on the way out. Turns out, and this is the part that had everybody with their jaws unhinged on the floor, Rick Ross was not in the bathroom at all. Rick Ross had already left the building. Rick Ross was on his way to the airport. Rick Ross had a flight to catch, and Rick Ross apparently decided that telling the hosts of his own interview goodbye was not worth the 90 seconds it would have taken. He tapped out mid-conversation and left DC Young Fly, Carlos, and Chico sitting there staring at an empty chair like they had just witnessed a magic trick performed at their own dinner table. And if that had been the end of it, maybe, just maybe, this whole thing would have quietly died. But it was not the end of it. Because here is where the story really gets spicy. Rick Ross did not just leave the 85 South show to catch a flight. Rick Ross left the 85 South show and immediately turned around and sat down for a completely different interview, a 2-hour, no-holds-barred, ask-me-anything sit-down on a mostly white-run podcast, where he answered every single uncomfortable personal question you could think of, including the classic, "Were you a correctional officer?" question that has followed Rick Ross around for over a decade. Think about that for a second. Rick Ross would not give DC Young Fly and the 85 South couch a full interview. But Rick Ross would sit on a different couch, in a different room, in front of a different demographic, and let complete strangers pick apart his personal life for 2 straight hours. And the internet clocked it. DC Young Fly clocked it. The culture clocked it. But DC Young Fly, being the professional he is, said absolutely nothing. Not a word. Not a subtweet. Not a shot. Not even a side-eye caught on camera. DC Young Fly took the loss on the chin and kept the show moving. Fast forward to right now, 2026, and the whole thing finally cracks wide open. DC Young Fly pulls up to the Rory and Mal podcast, and Mal casually asks about the moment. And DC Young Fly does something rare, something almost surgical. DC Young Fly explains exactly why the situation stung him, without ever raising his voice, without ever losing his composure. This is where DC Young Fly separates himself from every other podcaster in the game. DC Young Fly told Rory and Mal, and I am paraphrasing here so we stay clean, that Rick Ross is one of the most gifted lyricists the South has ever produced. DC Young Fly said Rick Ross puts real poetic craft into every single verse. DC Young Fly said he and the entire 85 South family rocked with Rick Ross before any of this ever happened, and DC Young Fly said the respect for Rick Ross's artistry has never wavered. And then DC Young Fly dropped the line that flipped the entire narrative. DC Young Fly said Rick Ross did not owe them an explanation for leaving, but Rick Ross did owe them the basic human courtesy of saying goodbye. That was it. That was the whole ask. Respect the room. But DC Young Fly was not finished. DC Young Fly then laid down the exact reason the whole situation felt like a slap in the face. DC Young Fly said the moment Rick Ross walked out of their show, Rick Ross sat down at a Whiterun podcast for 2 whole hours and let those hosts ask him things DC Young Fly and the 85 South family would never have dared to ask. DC Young Fly said that hit different. DC Young Fly said that is the moment the whole thing turned from a rude exit into something that felt deeply personal. And DC Young Fly said, do not tell me it was about money. Do not tell me it was about audience size. Do not tell me it was about numbers. Because we have the numbers. We have the platform. We have the reach. And we have the love. DC Young Fly said the only reason a man walks out on his own community and then sits down with strangers for double the time is a mindset. And DC Young Fly was not going to say the exact word out loud, but you could feel it hanging in the studio air like humidity before a storm. Here is the moment everyone is going to remember from this entire saga. DC Young Fly said, quote unquote, we love you, but do not do us like that. And that one sentence went off in the culture like a bomb dropped in a library. Because that was not hate. That was not envy. That was not clout chasing. That was a big brother telling another big brother, you crossed a line that never needed to be crossed. And in hip-hop, the softest confrontations are the ones that hit the hardest. Now the second Rick Ross caught wind of DC Young Fly's Rory and Mal breakdown, Rick Ross had to respond. And I need you to grab something to hold on to right now, because Rick Ross's response is one of the most bizarre pieces of celebrity damage control I have witnessed in the last 5 years of covering hip-hop. Rick Ross did not sit down at a desk. Rick Ross did not put on a suit. Rick Ross did not schedule a proper reply video with lighting and a director. Rick Ross recorded his entire defense from inside his personal swimming pool. I am serious. I am dead serious. Rick Ross recorded an Instagram story, floating in his own pool, half his body underwater, defending himself to DC Young Fly like a cartoon supervillain running a press conference from inside a hot tub. And the entire internet immediately lost its mind. Nobody had their bingo card marked for Rick Ross responding to DC Young Fly while doing the backstroke, but here we are, in the year 2026, watching a hip-hop mogul defend his honor from a pool float. Inside the pool response, Rick Ross made his case, point by point. Rick Ross said he came to the 85 South show for free. Rick Ross said he did not charge a single dime. Rick Ross said he did not ask about the show's analytics or download numbers. Rick Ross said he pulled up wearing a Gucci jacket he had picked out especially for the appearance, and Rick Ross said he wasted that Gucci jacket because he had to leave early and never wore it again in public. Rick Ross said every second of it was done out of love for DC Young Fly and the 85 South family, and Rick Ross said the way DC Young Fly framed the story on Rory and Mal made Rick Ross look worse than the situation actually deserved. And then, because Rick Ross is Rick Ross ended his poolside sermon by requesting lemon pepper wings for his next appearance. Rick Ross said, next time I pull up, have some lemon pepper wings ready. Rick Ross said, if you do not have my wings, I am walking off again. Rick Ross literally, while floating in chlorinated water in front of millions of people, turned a beef response into a food order. And I promise you on my life, that clip is going to live rent-free on hip-hop timelines for the rest of the year, maybe the rest of the decade. But DC Young Fly does not lose battles like this. DC Young Fly does not, has never, and will never lose a war of words on the internet. And the second DC Young Fly saw the pool video, DC Young Fly went bar for bar with Rick Ross in a way that had grown men on the timeline calling their mamas for backup. DC Young Fly said, "Rick Ross, you did not invent doing the show for free." DC Young Fly said Boozy did it for free. DC Young Fly said T.I. did it for free. DC Young Fly said Busta Rhymes did it for free. DC Young Fly said Snoop Dogg did it for free. DC Young Fly said every single artist who has ever sat on that 85 South couch did it for free. Rick Ross was not special. Rick Ross was not the exception to the rule. Rick Ross was not the first. And Rick Ross does not get to hold that up like a trophy on a shelf. Then DC Young Fly went in for the kill. DC Young Fly said, and I am quoting the energy here more than the exact words, "When you call a spade, it gets hot." And where does a man go when it gets hot? DC Young Fly said Rick Ross went to talk to his little homie in the pool because it was hot and Rick Ross needed to cool himself off. Nobody on the internet recovered from that line for the rest of the night. That is one of those bars that gets screenshotted, memed, printed on a t-shirt, and repeated at every barber shop in the country for months. And then, just when you thought DC Young Fly was done, DC Young Fly offered to buy the Gucci jacket right off of Rick Ross's back. DC Young Fly said, "We respect the fact that you have moves to make." DC Young Fly said, "Just tell us when you get here, little homies, I have got an hour, and we will make sure you are out in time to catch your flight." DC Young Fly said, "Do not pull up acting like you are doing us a favor and then vanish into thin air." DC Young Fly said, "We called your team when you left, and even your own team did not know where you were going." That right there, that one single line, is the reason DC Young Fly is one of the most feared and respected voices in hip-hop podcasting today. Now here is why we are all watching this video at 3 in the morning right now. This whole thing looked squashed. It looked handled. It looked completely resolved. DC Young Fly had extended the olive branch. DC Young Fly said pull up anytime. DC Young Fly said the door is open. DC Young Fly said no hard feelings. And every hip-hop reporter with a keyboard officially called this beef over, done, wrapped, and buried. And then Rick Ross did the unthinkable. Rick Ross dropped brand new music. Rick Ross went into the studio, hit the record button, opened his mouth on a fresh beat, and put DC Young Fly's name directly into a bar on wax. Rick Ross took a personal disagreement that had already been publicly settled and etched it into permanent hip-hop history. Rick Ross took it off the internet, took it out of the pool, took it out of the comments section, and put it on a track that will exist forever. And I need you to understand what that means in the culture. Putting somebody's name on a track is not a joke. Putting somebody's name on a track is a declaration of intent. Putting somebody's name on a track is a receipt that outlives every subtweet, every live stream, every Instagram story, every podcast clip, every screenshot ever posted. Rick Ross could have kept this in the pool. Rick Ross could have kept this on the timeline. Rick Ross could have kept this on the podcast circuit. Rick Ross could have called DC Young Fly on the phone. But Rick Ross made the deliberate choice to bring DC Young Fly into the booth, and the second Rick Ross did that, the entire game changed forever. DC Young Fly, of course, heard the bar. DC Young Fly clocked the bar. DC Young Fly rewound the bar. DC Young Fly turned right around and posted his own reaction, and DC Young Fly's face on camera said everything you needed to know without saying a single word. DC Young Fly said, "Well damn, boy, how you feel?" DC Young Fly said, "Hey, y'all go grab that album." DC Young Fly said, "Go get that album, gang. Go get that album." And anybody who knows DC Young Fly's comedy knows that when DC Young Fly gets that quiet, that measured, that calm, that surgical, something is coming. Now the entire hip-hop internet is stuck on one question, and this is exactly why you clicked on this video in the first place. Is DC Young Fly about to come back with an actual diss track? Is DC Young Fly about to take Rick Ross into the booth? Is DC Young Fly about to remind the entire culture that before the podcast career, before the acting career, before Wild and Out, before every hosting gig on television, DC Young Fly was one of the most feared freestylers in the entire city of Atlanta? Because make no mistake about it, DC Young Fly can absolutely rap. DC Young Fly is not a comedian who dabbles in music on the side. DC Young Fly is not somebody's cousin who thinks he sounds good in the car. DC Young Fly is a bar-heavy, punchline-loaded, technically gifted lyricist who chose comedy as a career path. And if DC Young Fly decides to answer Rick Ross bar for bar on a fresh instrumental, the entire hip-hop conversation is going to shift overnight, and every social media platform is going to break under the weight of the reactions. Here is what nobody is talking about, and this is the part that had me sitting in my chair for 20 minutes trying to figure out. There is a real, tangible, non-trivial possibility that this whole thing is a promotional play. Think about it for a second. Rick Ross just dropped an album. DC Young Fly has a podcast to promote and comedy tour dates to sell. Both of them benefit from the noise. Both of them benefit from the streams. Both of them benefit from the timeline chaos. And when you look at how perfectly the timing of every one of these responses lined up, it starts to look less like a beef and more like a masterclass in cross-promotional strategy. I am not saying it is fake. I am not saying it is real. I am saying keep your eyes wide open, because in 2026, the line between a real hip-hop beef and a marketing rollout has never been thinner or blurrier. And that is exactly why this thing is going to keep growing. Because whether it is real or whether it is promotional, the numbers do not lie. Rick Ross just made a bar with DC Young Fly's name in it trend for 72 hours straight. DC Young Fly just made a Rory and Mal breakdown clip crossover into audiences that did not know either of these two men existed a week ago. Every hip-hop platform is running the story. Every hip-hop podcast is running the story. Every gossip page is running the story. And the two men at the center of it are watching their engagement numbers hit levels neither of them has personally seen in months, maybe years. Let me ask you something before we close this out. When was the last time a rap beef was actually a rap beef, and not a marketing rollout with a release date attached? When was the last time you saw two grown men in hip-hop go at each other publicly and not have a project drop within 30 days of the argument? Take a second, think about it seriously, I will wait right here. Because the answer might tell you more about the current state of hip-hop in the year 2026 than any think piece from any music journalist ever could. Now if this is real, DC Young Fly has to respond. DC Young Fly has no choice in the matter. DC Young Fly cannot let his name sit on somebody else's record without an official reply, because the second he lets it slide, the youngest generation of rappers coming up behind him is going to treat him like a soft target. In hip-hop, silence after a name drop is a slow-motion death sentence. And DC Young Fly is too smart, too skilled, too competitive, and too self-aware to ever let that happen on his watch. And if this is promotional, DC Young Fly still wins the round. DC Young Fly still gets to jump on a track. DC Young Fly still gets to remind everybody that he has bars for days. DC Young Fly still gets to expand his audience by riding the exact same wave Rick Ross is currently riding. Either way you slice this thing, DC Young Fly cannot afford to sit still. Which brings us right back to the question the entire timeline is asking tonight. Does DC Young Fly hit Rick Ross back with a full-blown diss track, a real, in the booth, produced, engineered, mixed, mastered, and radio-ready response? Or does DC Young Fly stay in his lane and roast Rick Ross the exact way DC Young Fly has been roasting people for a decade now, on a podcast, on a stage, on a live stream, no beat required and no engineer needed? Because if DC Young Fly chooses the roast route, that path might actually cut deeper than any diss track ever could, and it might do it faster. Drop it in the comments below. I want to hear it from you directly. Do you want DC Young Fly to grab the microphone and get into the booth? Or do you want DC Young Fly to sit in his chair, look Rick Ross dead in the eye through a camera lens, and roast Rick Ross line by line the way only DC Young Fly can? There is no wrong answer, but there is definitely a spicy answer, and I want to see who has the guts to type it out loud in the comments below this video. My personal take, and I am going to catch heat for this, I already know I am, is that DC Young Fly and Rick Ross both know exactly what they are doing here. I think DC Young Fly and Rick Ross are cooler behind the scenes than the internet realizes. I think DC Young Fly and Rick Ross are running a bag up together, whether they would ever publicly admit it or not, and I think the numbers are already proving both of them right. Because in 2026, the smartest thing two hip-hop veterans can do is turn a public disagreement into a shared payday, split the streams, split the clips, and split the algorithmic tailwind. And if that is what is actually happening between DC Young Fly and Rick Ross, then hats off to both of them, because they are running a clinic on modern content strategy. But I could be completely wrong. And that is exactly why I want to hear from you. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Diss track or roast session? Real beef or promo run? DC Young Fly bites back on wax, or DC Young Fly kills Rick Ross with a 2-minute podcast clip that goes viral before Rick Ross has time to blink. The comments section under this video is about to be a full-blown war zone, and I want a front row seat to every hot take, every prediction, every side take, and every wild theory. One last thing before I go, if you have not hit that subscribe button yet, I need you to seriously think about what you are doing with your life at this point, because we have got the fastest, sharpest, and most detailed hip-hop breakdowns on this entire platform, and you are missing every single one of them if you are not locked in. Tap subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in with us, because the second DC Young Fly responds, whether it is a bar, a roast, a full-blown diss track, or a surprise feature on somebody else's record, I am bringing you the full breakdown before anybody else on YouTube does. That is a promise, that is a guarantee, and that is why we are the fastest hip-hop channel on this platform. DC Young Fly and Rick Ross just handed us the most entertaining hip-hop storyline of the entire summer, and this thing is nowhere near over. There will be a response. There will be a reaction. There will be another round. And when it drops, you will hear it here first. Stay tuned. Stay sharp. And most of all, stay locked in with the culture, because in 2026, the culture is moving faster than ever, and we are the ones out here running with it.